In this video, we will discuss the basic elements of VBA programs. VBA programs are organized around the so-called objects. We have 4 levels of objects. At the very top level, we have application. So application basically refers to the software, which is Excel. And below application, we have workbooks. So each workbook is an Excel file. Within each workbook, we also have worksheets. And then in each worksheet, we have cells. Or if you have multiple cells, then we can call that range. So for this course, I'm going to ask you to understand these 4 levels of objects. So when we write a VBA program, how do we actually refer to an object? We're going to refer to an object following this order I just outlined. For example, if you have an Excel file, which is a workbook, let's say that this workbook is named VBA Part 1 .xlsx. Suppose this is your workbook, so that's your Excel file. And under this workbook, you have different worksheets. Suppose one of the sheet is called Sheet 1. And of course, in Sheet 1, you would have different cells. So this is your Excel rows and columns. And the first one is right here. So this will be the first row and the first column. That's the first cell in your spreadsheet. So how do we actually refer to this cell when writing a VBA program? So like I said, we follow this order. We start by saying application, which is the Excel software. This level does not change, it's always application. And then we use a dot to connect to the next level, which is a workbook. So it's going to be workbooks. This is the keyword. Okay. Workbooks, this one doesn't change. And then you need to say which workbook. Okay. So this is the file name, VBA Part 1. After we specify the workbook name, we're going to use another dot to connect to the next level, which is worksheet. So here, the keyword is worksheets. And in the parentheses is the name of the worksheet that you want to refer to. In this case, the name is Sheet 1. We're in Workbook VBA Part 1 and Worksheet, which is called Sheet 1. And then we can connect to the next level, which is the specific cell or cells. In this case, we want the very first cell in Sheet 1. So here we're going to use the keyword which is called range. Okay. Range can be used to refer to one cell, a single cell, or multiple cells. So later I'll talk about how to use range to refer to a block of cells. In this case, we want the first cell, which is A1. A is the column name, 1 is the row name. So first column, first row. So this is a complete reference to cell A1, to this particular cell. So here we use explicit reference to all these 4 levels of objects, okay, from application all the way down to the range. So we just discussed how to refer to Excel objects. Now let me provide some discussions on this topic. First, there are typically several ways to refer to the same object. In the previous slide, we refer to an object this way. We have 4 different levels. Normally, you would only use application to refer to Excel the software. This can typically be omitted. Okay. To refer to a workbook, and this is typically what we do. Keyword workbooks, and then the workbook name. There are alternative ways to do this, but this is the most commonly used way to refer to a workbook. But to refer to a worksheet, this is one way to do it, and we have at least 3 different ways to achieve the same thing. We can use a workbook name, which is what we just did, or you can use a workbook index. So here we're going to use an integer to refer to a workbook, or you can use the workbook code name. We'll talk about these in details in a future video. And also to refer to a cell or multiple cells, we also have many different ways. What we did is use the range keyword and then say the name of the cell. So this is cell A1 under the range keyword. To refer to the same cell, we can also use the cells keyword. So the cells keyword takes 2 integers. One is the row number, the other is the column number. Okay, so you use 2 integers to refer to cells. So in this case, cell A1 would be cells 1, 1, the first row and the first column. Okay. Again, we'll talk more about this in details, but it's important to keep in mind that there's typically several ways to achieve the same kind of reference, at least for worksheets and the range. The next thing I want to point out is that in order to actually make changes to an object, you have to make sure that the workbook you're referring to is actually open. Okay, you can only make changes to an open workbook. You cannot make changes to a closed workbook. Okay, so you can either click it open, like you would normally do to open a file, or you can actually use VBA code to open a workbook. The next thing I want to point out is that the example I give you is a full reference, meaning we start from the top level and then go down level by level. We didn't skip any level in this reference. From the software all the way down to the cell, everything is included, everything is explicit. But it is possible to omit these upper level objects. For example, you can omit application and start with workbooks. That's typically fine, and that's what we normally do. Normally, we do not include this application level when we refer to cells. Okay? There are cases where this is necessary, but when you refer to a cell, application is typically not necessary. You can also omit, for example, workbook name and worksheet name. So it's perfectly legal to just say range A1 without anything in front. And of course, when you do this, you need to understand that there's a risk. Because if you do this, then Excel will assume that what you mean is the cell A1 in the currently active workbook and the currently active worksheet. Okay? So Excel, if you do not include any of these upper level objects in your reference, just say cell A1, then Excel will assume that what you mean is the A1 in the currently active worksheet and the currently active workbook. So what does that mean? What does active mean? For example, if you have 2 workbooks opened on your computer, let's say one is called book 1, the other is called book 2. So which one is active? Well, if you use your mouse to click on one of them, then that one will be active. Okay. Similarly, if within this workbook you have several worksheets, which one is active? Well, if you use your mouse to select one of them, then that worksheet is active. Again, you can use your mouse click to activate a workbook and a worksheet, or you can use VBA code to do the activation, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the important thing to keep in mind is that typically it is safer to use this full explicit reference, just in case you have multiple workbooks, multiple worksheets open, and using a shorthand like this might cause confusion if you're not sure which one is currently active. Okay. So it is safer to do it this way. But of course, if you do it this way, the code will become longer. But there are ways to make the code shorter and still do it explicitly. Okay, we'll talk about that later. It's important to keep in mind that this is a safer way to do things. Okay. So how do we activate an object using VBA code instead of mouse click? Okay. It's pretty straightforward. For example, if you want to activate workbook, which is called VBA part 1, then you just say workbook VBA part 1 dot activate. So the activate here is a keyword. So that's like an action. We're asking the workbook to take an action, which is to activate it. Or if you want to activate a particular worksheet, then you can also say that worksheets activate. Okay. So activate here is the keyword. Okay, so far we have covered how to refer to a VBA object. But then after you refer to an object, what do you do with that object? So in order to take a meaningful action in VBA, after referring to an object, for example, range A1, we need to follow this object with one of these three things. You either talk about the properties of that project and do something about that properties, or you can ask this project to take some actions, which is method. Okay. In more advanced programming, you can also do some events, but as an introductory course, we're not going to be focusing on events. So we're going to be focusing on properties and methods of a project. First, let's take a look at property. So what can be the property of a project? Let's say that you have range A1. Okay. So one property could be the color of that cell. Remember, range A1 refers to cell A1, right? So in Excel, you know that by clicking on a menu, you can change the color of that cell. So which property is that? That property is called interior color. So everything is connected by dots. This refers to the background color of cell A1. That's a property of cell A1. And what can we do with it? For example, we can change it. We can assign some value. So VBA has these keywords for different colors, right? So the basic one would be VB blue, VB yellow, VB red. I think there are a few colors like that. And they also have much more sophisticated colors. Okay? So we can start with this basic one. This line of code would change the color of cell A1 to blue. Okay? So that's interior color. And you can also change the font color. So font color refers to the color of the content or the letters, the numbers inside A1. Okay? And the other thing, of course, you can also change the content of cell A1. Right? You can say that let's change the content of A1 to something. Okay? Say hello. So if you do this, then you're changing the content of A1 to hello. These are the properties of a cell. And all the objects have properties. For example, a worksheet has properties, right? So remember, in a worksheet, you have a tab name. That's the name of that worksheet. So that's the property of that worksheet. By assigning some different name, then you would be changing the name you see on the screen. Okay. So here we have a mini project that asks you to perform these tasks in VBA. So write a subroutine to achieve these goals. Okay. So give it a try, and the answer and the discussion of this project is provided in a separate video called Mini Project 1. So we can also follow an object with different methods. So methods are essentially actions. Okay? For example, we can add something or we can make a copy of an object. So if you want to make a copy of the content in cell A1, you can simply say that range A1, this is the object, dot copy. So the copy here is the action or the method. So we'll generate a copy of A1. So at this point, you'd probably be wondering, okay, if you generate a copy of A1, and where do we copy that to, right? So normally, when we deal with methods, we cannot just stop at dot this method. We have to provide some further information so that VBA understands exactly what we want to do with this particular method. Say when we want to make a copy of the content in A1, we need to say where do we want to copy that to. So here, we need to achieve that goal using an argument. This particular argument is called a destination. So we're making a copy of cell A1 and copy that to a particular destination. We'll talk about more examples of methods later, but here I want you to just remember, first of all, you say object dot that method, and then you often have to follow that with a bunch of arguments to better define that method. Okay? So here, destination is a keyword in my example. Okay? And destination equal to something. And also the other thing to pay attention to is that you don't just say destination equal to, you also have to add this colon before the equal sign. This is a fixed combination. You always have to do this, following an argument. Okay. And here we have one argument. If you need more than one argument, you will just use comma to separate different arguments.